Hi, I'm Katherine Mangu-Ward with Reason Magazine, and I'm pretty excited to be doing a Blogging Heads today with...
I'm Mark Schmitt with the Roosevelt Institute, and I think both of us, it's been a long time since we've done Blogging Heads.
It's true. This is going to be like a Blogging Heads vintage edition or something.
Although I don't think we've ever done one together before.
No, that's true.
We've argued in other forums, but not this one. So it doesn't really count. Like if people have an argument and it's not on Blogging Heads, it's the tree that falls in the forest.
Right. It's picks or it didn't happen. Exactly. Right. So we're gonna rectify that right now. And I think the best thing for us to start out fighting about is probably the right to work excitement in Michigan right now. I don't know if there's a more neutral term to describe what's going on.
I think sometimes there's some language terms that just they're loaded, but people live with them anyway.
Yeah,
it's like I never liked the term boyfriend or girlfriend, but after a while you just you use it because there's not really a better word until you get married. And then you don't have to use that word anymore.
Yeah, that is a solution. Somebody once introduced me to the term puzzle queue. Have you ever heard this term?
Yes, I have.
I think that's fantastic. Right. I wish that.
But that's for living together. That was
not
for
inclusive.
Living together. So that only counts.
Right, but that's
cohabiting.
I think that's the place where the boyfriend girlfriend terminology becomes unsatisfying. Is like we don't go to the movies on Saturday nights. We're basically married, but we're not. We're puzzle queues.
Right.
But
we're getting instantly off topic, which is great. But I always like the term partner, which Brits use happily. But just seems very awkward for an American. I don't know why.
Yeah, well, you're sort of vaguely like, so you both invested in some kind of shady business venture together, and it's and I suppose in some sense you have, right, the shady venture that is your relationship.
Yeah, exactly. Because everything's economic. Everything's a capital transaction in the United States. It's tainted.
I think if you believe the covers of the Washington the Atlantic Monthly, and now also the cover of the New Republic, then like marriage and childbearing really is like a kind of massive game theory type situation. So I suppose we could get into that too later. But first, let's.
Well, at least everybody's eligible for the game now.
Yes. Okay. So what is your take on what's going on in Michigan? How do you think it's going to play out in the next weeks and months?
Well, I'm not sure I know. I mean, I think it is something. It is one of those things that I think will, energize a level of reaction that I think is probably going to be much greater than what happened in Wisconsin. I mean, Wisconsin, there was a broad. Even people who are, so closely targeted in Wisconsin to public sector unions, there was a broad awareness that the pension costs of the public sector unions are fairly high. I mean, so that there was a lot of, I think there was a widespread ambivalence in Wisconsin about, the general role of public sector unions. It is, and I haven't spent much time of my life in Michigan at all, but it is hard to imagine that in a state in which unions and union jobs have been so central to their sense of economic opportunity for decades and decades, that there would be a similar ambivalence to basic labor law in private sector unions, and the tremendously undemocratic way in which it was pushed through, taints it in a particular way. Now, I think, sometimes it's funny because we're about to go through a lame duck in Washington, or we're kind of technically in a lame duck in Washington, where some things are going to get done that are probably positive things that nobody really wanted to deal with before the election. So that sometimes that sort of slightly anti-democratic context can be almost helpful, but at other times it can be used to do something that is dramatically doesn't reflect the will of the legislature that was just voted in, and wasn't something that people campaigned on.
I'm gonna push back on you a little bit here. So it sounds like what you're saying is when things happen during lame duck sessions or through processes that are that rely on kind of technical trickery, and they're the things that you like, then that's good. But if they're the things that you don't like, then they're anti-democratic and bad. I mean,
I think sometimes.
But that's fine. You can just say that.
I'm not quite saying that, because I think sometimes there are things that are they're just a little too fraught. Sometimes some of the the Treaty on Disability, which actually failed in the lame duck, but that's the kind of thing it's safer to bring up in the lame duck. I think I'd feel differently about this one if it was something that it was something that the governor had not really been out there campaigning for. It was something that had been on the agenda at all beforehand. And and there was some consensus
Well, it's not like people
that needed to be done.
It's not like people were unaware, though, right? That it's not like people were unaware that Republicans, by and large, have a kind of an anti-union agenda. Right. I mean, that's
Governor Snyder says,
for instance,
pro-union. So I mean, that's apparently, that's what he said on Morning Joe this morning.
Well, I mean, you can be pro-union and still be in favor of right to work laws. I mean, I think that is something that. Especially as these things get more heated.
Where there are unions,
I actually think you really can. As these things get more heated, it's easy to just kind of totally polarize and be like, unions, evil. But but I actually think that there are a lot of people, a lot of libertarians, for instance, who say, listen, unions are at their heart and should be sort of this wonderful institution that's arisen from our right to free assembly and to speak with institutional voice, and that the problem is just when they get in bed with big government and they get special legal privileges. I don't think that's an anti-union stance. I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable to use anti-union as a shorthand for that stance, right. But it's not actually the same thing as saying, like, workers shouldn't be able to get together and negotiate with their employers. It's just saying the current legal balance favors unions too much.
I mean, I don't think the current legal balance favors unions too much. It's almost impossible to form a union at this point in the country. And to the extent that you're able to split people off so that some people are essentially free riders on the benefits of collective bargaining and others, and while others are putting in that commitment and the dues and so forth, it tremendously undermines the concept of a labor union, which is solidarity among all the workers who are working for that company. And I mean, I think it's really amazing to do this in Michigan, where particularly where the auto workers really did give up so much in order to make sure that industry survived. I mean, there were tremendous concessions on their part, and that I think they were absolutely the right concessions to make. But it's not like you can look at Michigan right now and say, oh my God, the unions are such a stranglehold on the private sector that they're destroying the industry they're dependent on.
It's definitely true that unions are weaker now than they have been in the past. I mean, I would argue that at least in part that's true because workers don't want them, or maybe even need them now as much as they did in the past. And I think while it is true that the unions made concessions to keep the auto industry alive, they did get hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars in exchange for those concessions. I mean, not just to their industry generally, but that a lot of that money did go specifically to support continued strength in their pension funds and continued viability of union-specific benefits and the stuff that unions generate.
And we have a government role in it.
It's not like they were like, oh, you know what, we love American auto industry so much that we will make sacrifices, and that's cool. It was part of a bargaining game, and I think they did pretty well.
I mean, one way or another, it all worked out in the balance. I mean, there were definitely huge concessions. I mean, the question of why, I mean, a lot of workers would be better off with unions, and I say that as somebody who I don't think the unionized world is coming back. I don't have a, I think we need to get beyond the 50s, 60s nostalgia that people seem to have discovered. But I mean, it definitely seems to be the case that a major factor in the kind of hollowing out of the middle of the job market in particular, and the weakening of wages in the middle for workers with some skills, but not super skilled white collar workers who can kind of bargain on their own. It's pretty clear that wage stagnation at that level has something to do, maybe a lot, maybe just something to do with the reduced bargaining power of workers. And the only thing that's ever given workers the level of power to bargain for kind of their share of productivity gains and their own hard work, the only thing that's ever done that has been unions. Now, I think we have to figure out something else that's going to do that, but and that's part of the Michigan context too. I mean, that this could be possible is in itself an indication of the weakness of unions. I mean, this is something that would be unimaginable 15 years ago.
Right. No, I think you're right about that, and particularly as you say, I mean, everybody has emphasized this, but it's like Michigan.
Yeah.
Really?
Right.
They have
and they've had conservative Republican governors
that?
before. I mean, John Engler was the governor.
Yeah.
It's not like this is the first time they've ever had conservative governance. But it was always part of it was sort of part of the deal, and no place embodied the deal between labor and capital more than Michigan, I guess.
Well, and that deal is breaking down in a lot of
Right.
places, and so maybe its total breakdown in Michigan is in fact symbolic. So I have been a member of a union. Have you ever been a member of a union?
I was actually briefly a member of a union.
So I had my limited union experience was when I was working at the New York Times. I was technically classified as a clerk because I was a lowly underling, and as a result of that, I was unionized. They just took a chunk out of my paycheck, and I would get emails every now and then telling me the things that the union was doing for me, and that was that. And I found it to be not a great kind of worker positive experience.
I've had this.
Certainly,
I've had the same
argument from anecdote only gets you so far, right? But I would get emails saying, the union will represent you in X, Y, and Z cases of wrongful termination, and the X, Y, and Z would be like, yeah, I would have fired that person. That person probably should be fired. So I mean, and then they
you might also
paycheck
you might make that conclusion, but you might also think
money.
you need some representation in a situation like that. It might be valuable.
Sure, although there are lots of ways to get representation outside of a union, but also I just think it's in many ways this is the same thing where a government takes a chunk out of your paycheck for any reason or allows unions to have the power to do that, which is I kind of would have liked the cash. I was not I was a young, starting out journalist at the time, and that 5% would have made a difference to me, and I don't think I was getting that much from the union. I mean, I wonder what you say to that.
Well, what I say to that is the same thing. I mean, I remember Matt Welch saying the same thing to me about when he worked at the LA Times. It's like, that's just, it was a job you were doing for some experience. You, at the time, I assume, weren't supporting a family. You didn't necessarily intend to be working for the New York Times forever. It's a very different situation than the 50-year-old guy who's worked for 25 years in the print shop and expects to retire, and if he's fired for arbitrary reasons, it's a disaster for his family, or any number of people for whom that job relationship is much more vital to them than if you're just starting out in your career. And what you've got for you, you've got a ton of things going for you that give you your own power to bargain. You have a degree from Yale. You have, a whole set of your own skills, and you're kind of at that stage in your career, you probably say, oh, look, I could go move that. I can move. Maybe I'll move to Chicago. Maybe I'll move to DC. You've got a ton of options that are very, very different. So it's easy for you to say, I didn't really need the union. And it's kind of like I remember living in DC in the 90s when the city government was a total disaster, and feeling like, it's completely outrageous. I don't really need city government. And so I don't really care that much about it. But for a lot of people, it's a very different situation. So just because in that particular circumstance you didn't particularly need the union, I just think you and I think Matt, when we had this argument before, kind of overgeneralized from that.
So that's, I think, a perfectly good point that there are some people who are better positioned to negotiate on their own. Right. But at the same time, the bargain of the union, the deal is that they get to take money from people who don't need the union, people like me, who you've just said, yes, in fact, you probably would be fine without the union. If you lose your job, it's not a big deal. You have communication skills that other people might not have to make your case if you're fired unjustly. But the whole deal is that the union gets to take money from me so that they can fight for that 50-year-old guy. And it's not, it could be a deal that people would want to voluntarily buy into, in which case they could voluntarily join a union. But I don't see why that deal should get special privileging, like a special status from the government.
Well, because it's like any other. It's like any other kind of we're in this together kind of deal. I mean, you may not need those benefits at this point. Maybe if you'd stayed there, you would need them at some other point in your career. If it's all dependent on the people who need it most, it will actually place the greatest burden on the people who are able to do it least. Just like a health insurance system that only covered people who felt that at that moment they needed health insurance would be extremely expensive for those individual people, as opposed to one in which we're all sharing. I mean, I pay my Medicare tax, and I'm not currently on Medicare. That doesn't mean it's not doing something for me. It's doing a lot for me.
And yet, up until a couple of years ago, I would have said, yes, but the crucial difference is you have a choice about whether or not to buy health insurance, which segues us nicely into our other topic of discussion.
I don't want a choice. I shouldn't have a choice about whether or not to buy health insurance.
Well, I mean, that is, of course, exactly what we're about to talk about here. Not just that specifically, but also the sort of generalized fiscal confusion and malaise surrounding Washington, D.C. right now in the form of the fiscal cliff. And while Obamacare is not directly a part of that, in the sense that a lot of this is about sort of dealing with legacies of previous administrations, I'm interested also to hear your take on, what's going to happen. Let's start with just a pure, shameless pundit-style prognostication.
Right.
What's going to happen? What's going to happen on January 2nd?
I've always, you can always predict anything with a 70% certainty, I believe. So I will think there's a 70% chance that we will go over the fiscal cliff. But what I call, everybody has a different term for it. I heard the term the other day, the fiscal infinity pool. Personally, I like to use the term fiscal reset because it just kind of puts things back to largely to where they were, although the sequester's
the fiscal infinity pool sounds so glamorous.
Yeah, it sounds like glamorous. I'm actually not sure what it actually means. I'm not sure what. I mean, I guess that's a good metaphor for the idea that there's going to be one cliff. Basically we're going to set up another cliff and another cliff and another cliff. And,
No. It's referring to those pools in the fancy hotels.
Oh, I know what it means.
You can't see the edge, so you just come right up to the edge and you can't see it, and then.
Oh, you know what? I had it mixed up with those pools that they have a fan and you can do laps.
No, not those sad ones that are always advertised in like National Review. Those pools always make me depressed. Yeah. Because it's just like a treadmill, but a pool.
But it might fit in.
No, these are the fancy pants. These are the fancy pants
with the no edge. Okay, all right, got it.
Yeah.
I had those two things mixed up. Well, I'm no pundit because I don't even know the difference between two kinds of elite swimming pools.
Yeah, geez, you need the union somehow to help you.
Right. The think tank union. There are no unionized think tanks. That's something that somebody needs to do something about.
Oh, I'm clipping that and sending it to your future employers, by the way.
Anyway, I think I'm having trouble understanding whether there is, the outlines of a deal coming together, the outlines, something happening at a staff level. I mean, people always can produce something, especially when it's just, everybody says, okay, you staffers go into a room. You will produce. There are a million plans that could be produced. But obviously, I think the biggest politics right now is around Boehner and whether you can actually bring something to the floor, and whether, he clearly lined things up and I thought the ousting of the three Tea Party members from their committees was a good way of saying, Boehner and Paul Ryan and Eric Cantor are basically going to be on the same page. There's not going to be the chaos of 2011, which was really clearly involved an effort by Cantor to stand in the corner and say, when can I stab this guy in the back? And did a couple times. So clearly they want to avoid that. But they still have to bring something to the floor that gets, I think probably the, what they used to call the Hastert rule still applies, that, it has to get a majority of Republican votes. It can't be something that they're going to push through with mostly Democratic votes. And, even in 2000, we've continually had this situation where the Democrats have to come up with the votes for a deal that most Democrats wouldn't be interested in it at all. So that I don't know. I'm not sure I see how that dynamic plays out, and I can't imagine it really happening before the cliff, unless it's so clear to everybody that the negotiating position changes, after the taxes go up. Although it's complicated because it's like if you think it changes right at that, midnight January 2nd, then in effect, it's, all economics, game theory, whatever would tell you that in effect it would also be changed for the moments before that. You know what I mean? I mean, if you're fully equipped with this knowledge, it should be
like with the markets, where markets incorporate, not like the prices of various stocks are incorporated. They incorporate knowledge of upcoming announcements, right? It should be that this happened. And in fact, if you put on CNBC right now, it's like the fiscal cliff, the status of the fiscal cliff negotiations is the catch-all for like, oh, well, why did this weird market thing happen, right? Like they always, like if you're putting on 24 hours of programming about like, why did the markets just do that? And sometimes the answer is we have no idea. They kind of have to pick a thing and hold on to that. And right now,
CNBC's misunderstanding of what happens in Washington is hilarious, and almost all attempts to explain the market based on what's happening in Washington are usually a little wacky.
Well, it of course always helps that they want to do those explanations in like 2-minute bursts between like analysis of how Monsanto's stock looks or whatever.
It would be interesting. I think everybody wants to know, the empirical thing that we don't know is actually what would happen if, what happens, what do the markets do? I mean, there's plenty of reason to believe that, okay, if the markets have kind of priced in the idea that we'll hit the fiscal cliff, and that maybe there's not that significant a reaction on January 2nd. Just as I don't think there was that significant a reaction to the Moody's downgrade in 2011. And then there's a lot of leverage for the Obama administration. On the other hand, if it does, if there is a really extreme market reaction, and realistically, you shouldn't really care that much about it, because it'll be undone as quickly as it's done. But to the extent that people do care, do react to it, that's going to make the bargaining position a lot worse. So it's funny. I mean, we are once again, we used to be prisoners of the bond market. Now we're probably prisoners of the stock market, just in terms of these irrational reactions.
So what do we actually expect then? Not just on January 2nd or January 3rd, but what do you think the ultimate negotiated settlement finally looks like? I mean, as a kind of ongoing pessimist about the ability of Washington to actually make cuts, everything that I've heard about cuts, now not about the tax rates, which I think even Grover Norquist is like gone waffly on that, and he's like, well, maybe you could raise tax rates today if you promise to make some cuts tomorrow. So basically Republicans have like given a lot of ground there, and it's what you're describing with Bonner kind of clearing house and just taking charge. But do any cuts really happen? It seems to me that all the cuts that anyone is talking about, Republicans and Democrats, I think this is absolutely a bipartisan disease, are mostly, well, we're not going to do some of the spending that we actually really weren't going to do anyway, and we're going to count that, and we're going to count reductions in the rate of increase in spending,
but that's what you do. I mean, we only have this long-term deficit problem because we're scoring a set of major increases in spending, particularly on the health programs. So it's not like cutting the rate of growth isn't a real cut. It really is.
It is, but it's not. First of all, it's not at all what the layman thinks when he hears talks of cuts, right? I mean, and it's not what's being demagogued by people who oppose even those kinds of cuts.
Right, but when,
when you hear people saying, like, we have to fire the school teachers because the federal government won't be able to send big block grants to the states, which will cover their salaries, that's not what anyone is talking about happening, and yet that's what's being demagogued whenever cuts come up.
Well, I mean, it can be or cannot be. I mean, it depends what the cut is. I mean, if you do, for example, raise the Medicare eligibility age from 65 to 67, that's also something that's only going to cut it's only going to reduce future projected increases in future spending, not necessarily by that much, but it's a real thing. And of course, if you want to, if you think it's a terrible idea, of course you demagogue it, because it's going to be a very specific hit to people who are 65 and 66 years old. So I don't think I don't think it's irrational to treat those things as if they're real cuts. I mean, and if what we're concerned, the immediate deficit is largely driven by recession, and the long-term deficit is largely driven by Bush tax cuts and Medicare and Medicaid spending. So, figuring out how the immediate one, you really just need to get the economy going, and the long-term one, you need to deal with healthcare costs. So I don't think it's domestic discretionary spending has gone nowhere. Has basically declined, has not been going up. And my biggest fear is that and Henry Aaron of Brookings wrote a piece about this in Democracy Journal. My biggest fear is that progressives are so focused on protecting the entitlement programs, on protecting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, that we once again let domestic discretionary, which is really everything else, take a big hit. So that's something I'd be a little worried about. But I think realistically, to go back into the pundit mode, I think yes, some deal is out there probably after January that allows the top tax rate to go up. And the question is just, is it some piddling symbolic amount that allows the White House to say symbolically we increase taxes on the rich, like 37%, or is it real? I mean, frankly, I just think 39.6% is a perfectly reasonable rate for people who make over $250,000, and maybe below that as well. If I were running the world, not as punishment or anything else, just that's historically a very reasonable rate. We get it to that level. Does anything else happen? I mean, it's easy to see that happening, and then some deal where we say, we'll postpone the sequester. There's some, plan for tax reform, which is just a lot harder to do than people, I've always been a tax reform person, so it took me a long time to realize, and then sometime last fall I realized, oh, wait a minute, this is actually impossible and not really necessarily worth the effort.
Was that like a big crisis for you? This like existential crisis. It was close to an existential crisis for somebody like me. Yes, absolutely. And I'm trying to replace my faith in tax reform with something else. I might try one of those Scientology classes and see if it helps. I was going to say, have you considered Jesus? Because that may be your only choice at this point. No, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, right? That there's this kind of refuge that politicians often take in simplifying the tax code, closing loopholes, and then just sort of the broader cause of tax reform, which of course includes much, much more than that. But and that's often said in the same tone that politicians use for, we'll just cut waste and inefficiency. Right. And those are actually, I think you're quite right to say, like, tax reform, and I think that the sort of reduction of government waste are the two places that everyone agrees should be done and have not been done, partially because they're just really, really hard to do. But I mean, what I wonder is, I think your account of history is fine about what is driving our kind of deficit situation, but why not make cuts? I mean, it may be that the growth of spending hasn't been astronomical, although, it of course always depends on how you slice and dice the data. But I would argue that even discretionary spending has gone up, especially when you include, depending on how you count, wars and the like. But there have been countries that have looked at their own kind of messy fiscal situations and chosen to make real cuts as part of the package for solutions. I'm thinking here of Canada in the 90s and New Zealand in the 90s and 80s, and both of those were done by coalition governments or by liberal governments. Right. So, why not get rid of the Bureau of Forestry and send that all down to the states? That kind of thing. Well, I mean, do you just think that's not a fight worth picking, or do you think that's not a thing worth doing?
Well, first of all, I think when people say, get rid of this agency and send it all down to the states, that's not the same as a cut. That's a shift in responsibility, and then the question there is, at what level of government is that thing most effectively carried out? And I'm not, I think, if government were basically being run by, the Brookings Institution and the Urban Institute, we'd have some serious conversations about levels of responsibility. I remember, Alice Rivlin had a wonderful book, really when I was first working on the Hill, so like in the early 1990s, about, rearranging some responsibility, a shift where the federal government would take full responsibility for Medicaid, states would take full responsibility for education, things like, I think stuff like that is actually potentially really brilliant, and I think we have too much stuff where the responsibilities are messy, but I think that symbolically saying, oh, we're going to get rid of I'm not even sure what the Bureau of Forestry is, but, symbolically.
Well, it was in New Zealand. But,
in
New Zealand.
In New Zealand, yeah.
That was the Department of the Interior.
Right, it was some part of the Interior Department or whatever could be shifted to states. Maybe you'd want to do that, maybe not. I don't think. For me personally, there aren't major. Obviously, I've cut farm subsidies significantly. But and I would reduce defense spending, but that's politics. You're going to have to negotiate those things. Now, I think the biggest things you want to get under control. The big thing you want to get under control is health spending. Not only because it's coming out of the federal budget, but because as a society, we don't want to be spending 6.5%, 7.5% of GDP in what we know is very largely wasteful ways. So, that's just where I would concentrate it, and I would concentrate it on, finding ways to structure Medicare within a broadly reformed health system seems to be the best way to do that. It's not like, the Ryan plan for Medicare or the, Lieberman-Coburn plan are other ways of trying to get at that question. I don't like them because they restructure the system in a way that puts too much responsibility on the individual to control costs, where individuals have very little ability to control costs. But that's the right direction. That's where spending needs to be cut, knocking off even if you knocked off all three, whatever the three cabinet departments Rick Perry was going to cut, if you remembered which three he was going to cut, that's not going to be the major solution of the debt, especially of the long-term deficit, especially if it's just a matter of shifting responsibilities onto states, which then have to figure out how to do the taxing themselves.
And yet, don't we also aren't we sort of confronted with this history, which is that the history of Medicare and Medicaid are histories of failed attempts at cost control. There's a long, sad story, which actually was chronicled in Reason Magazine by our own Peter Suderman, and we'll throw the link in the sidebar, whichever side the sidebar is these days. Maybe the theme of our discussion of cuts here is it's all harder than it sounds, but this notion of taking a bureaucratic fix to control costs, rather than, as you say, putting at least more of that pressure on individual health consumers. We don't have a great record on that, right?
Well, we don't have a great record on putting it on the individual health consumers either, because costs are higher in the private healthcare system. So there are efforts. It is a long history of trying to get those programs under control, and some have worked and some haven't. And sometimes you have a system, and the political process kind of doesn't want to make those choices. That's why we have the doc fix every year for Medicare. But clearly, some things have worked. The other argument is that it's really hard to control costs in the public healthcare system when the public healthcare system is a limited section of the overall healthcare system. So unless you're able to really control costs, and that doesn't, that can simply be a matter of making the exchanges work well. It doesn't have to be, a single payer plan or anything like that. Although obviously a single payer plan is more effective at managing all those costs. If you're managing the costs in the non-public system or the publicly subsidized system, and it's subsidized one way or another before the ACA and after. If you're able to manage costs there, it's easier to manage overall costs in the Medicare in the Medicare and Medicaid systems as well. I mean, so we're in a sense we're in a different context than some of the past history. But I don't think, I mean, there are probably 800 different things, like whether coming out of the physician, what's now become the IPAB, and I think was previously the Physician Payment Review Board, although I might be mixing those two things up. Things coming out of those things, some of which have worked better than others. But clearly that's the mission if we're to get these things under control. Now there are other people. I mean, I know people whose view is, I know good economists whose view is, I'm not going to take projections that say we're going to spend, this percentage of GDP on Medicare, because it's things that are unimaginable aren't going to happen. Something's got to give. Now I think the answer to that is, well, at some point somebody has to actually make the choice to do something about that, and I think ideally that's what we should be doing now. But I don't think we're remotely close to being able to do that, just because of, in a way, partly because of the grandstanding about the Affordable Care Act makes it very difficult to actually use those cost control pieces, and there are people who don't really want to do it. Actually, I have a question for you.
I mean, go ahead. I was just going to push back on the word grandstanding, since I think you could equally characterize it as totally legitimate disagreement based on. It
was a loaded word. We'll treat it as like right, and we'll treat it as like right to work. It's the only word I have. But I mean, here's something I'm curious about. You hear conservatives say, there are kind of like two things they're asking for from the White House when it comes to healthcare spending. Really, there's just, when they say we want structural change in the healthcare entitlements, and they say the word means testing. And I don't think there's a Republican or conservative proposal out there to actually do means testing. It's kind of like they're asking the White House to come up with this. Do Republicans and conservatives actually want to do means testing on Medicare in particular? And why? And is it something that they really will stand behind?
Well, if I had any kind of exclusive access,
I shouldn't be treating you as
conservative mind,
not a spokesperson for Speaker Boehner.
I would be at least a richer woman than I am now if I could be selling kind of psychic insights into Republicans and conservatives. But I mean, what I will say is, I do think that people who use the words means testing when they're talking about entitlements do sincerely mean it and would sincerely support it. I think it's probably smart politics for them to say, like, listen, you're a Democrat. You already hate rich people. Go ahead and take their benefits away for us. I mean, to put it in its sort of crudest sense, right? But that in fact, a lot of these programs are doing an incredibly nonsensical thing, right? They're taking money from the median taxpayer and transferring it to long-lived, wealthy people who have lots of assets but not very much income, and that's something that I think it's like the Economist platform, right? There are all these things that every economist agrees about, but that will never actually go into law because the politics of it are too tricky. Right. I think in many ways this is one of them. But yeah, I think when the Heritage people put out a paper that says, well, one way that we could deal with some of these sort of seemingly intractable, some of the seemingly intractable math is to means test, I think they mean it. Heritage is not, or AEI, or pick your right-wingy think tank is certainly not ideologically invested in government transfers to the wealthy or even to the middle class. And actually, we did a big feature, again, to plug Reason Magazine, a while back about how, in some sense what we're facing is a trade-off between a robust social safety net and ongoing protection of the big three entitlements, right. And that the more that we sort of say Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security Medicare and Social Security are sacred, the more we kind of ultimately undermine the fiscal possibilities for just saying, listen, we're going to take care of poor people who really need it, and we're not going to we're not going to play this political game of dumping cash on grandma.
Right. Well, I mean, I followed that really. I followed that real
votes.
closely, and I found it really fascinating. And I think that was I think that was implicit in some of the things that Ryan said about protecting the social safety net, which a lot of people treated as completely disingenuous. But I do think there's a real theory there that says, when the social net is spread so broadly, and I think that also applies not just to the major entitlements, but to things like EITC and all the things that fit into the nation of takers argument, where we really actually are doing a lot more to support, the work, people who are moving into work, who are not the neediest, but who actually need support in the current economy. But I mean, obviously, the easiest way to means test anything is through the tax system. I mean, I think that the best step toward means testing Medicare was in the 1993 Clinton. I'm sorry, the best way for means testing Social Security was in the 1993 budget bill, the Clinton budget, where they taxed Social Security benefits for wealthier beneficiaries. I mean, you could basically, rather than saying, so you could raise Medicare premiums for wealthier people. You could simply tax wealthier seniors at different levels. You could use different ways to tax their assets. You could have some kind of estate tax that reached I mean, there's lots of ways to do that. Certainly, denying people Medicare is probably the worst way to do it, because it's still even if you're a well-off senior, it's going to be pretty difficult especially if you're in your 70s. It's going to be difficult to buy a full package of health insurance on the market, and it's going to be very difficult to pay out of your pocket for the kinds of care you might need. I mean, unless you're
true, but of course, the difficulty in buying health care when you're 70 on the market or in paying out of pocket is not something that goes away if the government. I mean, the underlying issue there is that offering health services to a 70-year-old is expensive, and asking the government to do that, I think you're right on the politics that, there are lots of kind of back channel ways that you could essentially take back most of the value of these entitlements from wealthier people. But I actually think it's, I think this is, again, in a kind of perfect world where we actually have the debate that we should be having, that's the debate is, well, why do we have these programs that have set it up in such a way that we somehow have a country full of 70-year-olds, more and more of them every day, who, don't think it should be their problem that healthcare is expensive when you're 70, who think that they're owed that coverage, even if they also think that they should pay taxes if they have a lot of assets.
Well, they're partly owed the coverage because they actually did pay for the coverage. I mean, right. It is in the nature of a social insurance program that you're paying over your working life for benefits that you receive in retirement.
And there's nobody who's actually proposing, right, let's cut off 66-year-olds tomorrow. So, but that argument I think only gets you so far. The social insurance argument, and whether or not that has kind of fiscal and budgetary reality is a separate question. But even so, the proposals that I think are serious and that are actually being considered on any level are still proposals that phase in people who have not paid in much, or frankly who, as polls show over and over, people my age have no expectation that we're getting back what we paid in anyway. So if that's true, if people really do think that money is already lost, then why not start with those people?
Right. Well, I mean, even proposals in order to actually affect the long-term deficit, you'd have to have proposals where people are still paying in, but wouldn't necessarily receive the benefits they expected to receive.
I mean, and I frankly think most people have no idea what's going on with any of this stuff anyway, right? I mean, I think it's easy for those of us who are interested in these issues, who are in Washington, who follow this stuff, to kind of overestimate the extent to which people have any opinion or knowledge whatsoever about those lines on their paycheck about what's going on.
Right, but why does that actually matter for the purpose of this argument? I mean, we're just kind of arguing about what we think is theoretically fair. I mean,
right, but it also matters because because what's viable in terms of people continuing to pay a certain level of taxes while expecting a different level of benefits in the future. And I think the average 27-year-old who has a decent job and who has a chunk coming out of their paycheck every month, if that line on the paycheck said something different next month about where that money was going, they wouldn't be like, oh my God, my bargain with the government about social insurance has been violated. It's just, I think, people understand that in some sense Washington is a big black hole of money, and the money just goes in, and then sometimes some money comes out, and they don't really know why.
Right. I mean, I think that's true. Although there are moments when people flash on certain parts of it, and it also has some. If you can reduce that, it does have some valuable economic effect. But I don't think that. I mean, it's still the case that when you say seniors are getting this benefit, seniors have all. I mean, a wealthier senior has also paid in a fair amount. I mean, liberals are attached. I mean, the interesting dilemma is that you say, well, Republicans might just say, you liberals hate the rich, which we don't. But liberals hate the rich. They should be willing to put this burden on them. In fact, of course, the liberal conception is that programs that have broad cross-class constituencies like Social Security and Medicare, which is a phrase that Theda Skocpol of Harvard uses. The broad cross-class constituency is what gives it political resilience over time, and that's an important thing to maintain. So that if you create this class of people who pay in and then really actually do realize they're getting nothing, or they're getting put on the private market or whatever, or you have people who, frankly, I was worried about proposals to really ramp up the Social Security payroll tax, to take the cap off of it that kicks in at about $102,000 cap. If you really do that, if you really blew the cap off, you'd have a lot of people who are paying vastly more into Social Security than they'll ever get, which really isn't the case now. So you break that cross-class constituency. That's the theory for liberals, which I think is a questionable theory. I mean, I think that's a theory that we ought to start thinking twice about, because I don't think it. I don't think
so
it really
that's what I was going to
holds
say. Is that I think the cross-class resilience theory is accurate in the sense that it's created this monster, right? It's created this entitlement that virtually everyone supports, that no one supports cuts in, and that we can't afford to have continue to exist in its exact current form in the long term. So that resilience is not always a good thing. But also I think that there is sort of that theory is coming into question, and the fact is that people by and large tell pollsters at least that they think one of the roles of government is to transfer some money from the rich to the poor. And I might not love that baseline as a semi-rabid libertarian, but if people really do think that, and if they really do have what I think is kind of a generalized, almost odd indifference to the money that disappears from their paycheck every month, I'm not sure that I actually buy this theory that if they don't get their Social Security checks, the whole thing falls apart. Right. Rich people don't get their Social Security checks.
And I'm really struck by, there are a number of programs like, the State Children's Health Insurance Program, for example, that have been really quite popular. And I think part of that is because there's a sense that they really are targeted towards, people who really need support, and that there's less hostility about that than we often, particularly people whose formative experiences had to do with the really nasty politics around welfare, which is a big part of my experience. But there's a little more resilience to programs like that than we thought. So that maybe potentially there's some basis for some. I mean, it's hard to envision a world in which there's even the beginnings of bipartisan or cross-ideological agreement going forward. But I almost see glimmers of something where we say, well, maybe we can actually strengthen the safety net for people who need it the most, and begin to think about how you actually do something at the high end. I mean, I still think, Medicare and Social Security are different, because Social Security is just cash and you may not need it, or Medicare is the challenge of how do you actually create a structure that provides health insurance to people, and that's it's a much more complicated structural problem, and you can do things to it that throw the whole system out of whack, or actually radically, if you knock the healthiest people out of the system, actually radically increased costs and things like that, and the wealthier people actually tend to be healthier. So, I think that's a much more complicated one. I feel like there's the germ there somewhere, to the extent that to the extent that it's all sincere, and that liberals can begin to get beyond the cross-class constituency equals resiliency assumption. Maybe there's some future.
I, of course, have a baseline distrust of anything that is bipartisan that comes out of Washington, since I assume that what it means is that everyone got more money.
Right.
So somehow I have this terrible vision that Washington comes together and agrees that we're going to strengthen the social safety net, and that that's our priority, and that somehow nothing gets cut and more programs.
Which is a classic, a classic kind of public choice view of how Washington works. I mean, the funny thing is, it's kind of, everything about the setup of the fiscal cliff negotiation, or the way people talk about tax reform or whatever, is based on the assumption that if there's a shared belief that we have to either reduce overall spending, and I think you're in the camp of like reduce spending is more important than reducing the long-term deficit. So that's a slightly different place. But if there's a consensus about reducing long-term fiscal obligations, then only by everybody holding hands and jumping at once can you actually do that. And there are, of course, those models where that's happened, but they're really outdated models. I mean, I worked on the Hill for Bill Bradley. It was, after they'd done tax reform in the 80s, but that was still, that was in everybody's head as this model. You just needed everybody. There were people who were on the outs of that, because there were the people who really were, whose states or whose constituents or whose campaign contributors really were the biggest beneficiaries of the really scam tax expenditures we had at the time. But, it had to be Republicans, right, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, kind of holding hands and jumping together. The base closing commission is obviously also a good example. There's a couple examples. What they all have in common is they're at least 20 years old, at least right, in their origins. But when you say that, Catherine, you are kind of challenging one of the core assumptions of why it is we're here in this fiscal cliff situation and what becomes possible, right?
Well, that is probably a good note for us to end on. Although we had discussed ending on a happier note, which was I guess also holding hands and singing Christmas carols or something. What is your book gift recommendation? Let's do that. What is your book gift recommendation for this Christmas? What would you get for your fiscal cliff friends, or perhaps for your teenage nephews and nieces?
Well, I'm stumped for my teenage nephews and nieces. So I will say right now to my brother or my sister-in-law, if you're watching this, send some ideas, or to my niece and nephew. I'm pretty stumped all around this year. The best book I read this year, I'm not sure who it's a gift for, but it's definitely a good gift for both libertarians and liberals, and for thinking about this conversation and government and the economy. But it's also a wonderful novel. It's a book called Red Plenty by Francis Spufford, which is about the Soviet Union during those years in the 50s and early 60s, where they thought they were moving toward kind of planned prosperity, and it seemed like they were, and it kind of fell apart. It's a kind of fact-based fiction that I really loved. But I read that earlier in the year, and now at the moment I'm trying to reread Middlemarch, but I'm not going to give that to anybody because I assume everyone's read it.
Yeah, that's one of those books that sits on the nightstand, and you're like, this year maybe. But so my recommendation is actually maybe a sort of a counter recommendation. I'm reading right now to review it a book called A Rule Is to Break: A Child's Guide to Anarchy, mm-hmm. and it's an alphabet for tiny anarchists that is blurbed by none other than Bill Ayers on the back.
Good.
And it's not, there's something for all kinds of anarchists in there. A little blue-haired child who is defying the system and refusing to take baths, and also not participating in the commercial food system. So if you have an overly well-behaved child,
I do, as a matter of fact,
which I'm sure
I do,
then you might want to consider the Child's Guide to
a little anarchy
would
would actually be welcome. In
All right,
in this
so
family.
so there you
all
go.
right, well, very good. So those are two good recommendations for people. I'm not sure. Not sure mine is the best present. It's an interesting book, but yours sounds great. Okay. Well, it was
very
fun
nice
to have
talking
this
with you.
conversation, Catherine, and hopefully we'll do it again.
All right,
Okay.
bye.
Bye bye.